you know what happened to Britain's deadliest fighter pilot on November 23, 1917? 19 confirmed kills, one of the deadliest aces the Royal Flying Corps had ever produced. A pilot who'd survived every dogfight, every German ambush, every mission over the Western Front for 18 consecutive months, until he chased a light that shouldn't exist. Tonight, I'm going to share testimony about Captain Edward Manock that's been sealed in British military archives since 1917.
What we know about the Great War is extensive. The trenches where millions died in mud and blood, artillery bombardments that transformed entire landscapes into lunar craters, mustard gas that blinded and choked terrified soldiers, massive infantry assaults against machine guns that mowed down lives by the thousands. This history is documented, archived, taught in schools around the world. What's been systematically buried for over a century is what some of those men witnessed in the skies, what experienced combat pilots reported seeing and were immediately silenced for describing, what the Royal Flying Corps worked desperately to classify, suppress, and erase from official history. November 23, 1917, Cambrai sector, France. The Battle of Cambrai was entering its fourth day of operations. British forces under the command of General Julian Byng had launched the world's first massive tank assault on November 20th. The initial gains were spectacular. 6 miles of German lines shattered within hours. 378 Mark IV tanks advancing through barbed wire like it didn't exist. But by November 23rd, the situation had changed dramatically. The German counterattack was underway. The 231st Infantry Regiment and the 3rd Guards Division were pushing with brutal force toward newly captured British positions. The Royal Flying Corps was flying constant reconnaissance missions, trying to track German troop movements through rapidly deteriorating weather. Number 56 Squadron operated from an airfield at Estrie-Blanche, approximately 30 miles behind British lines. They flew SE-5A fighters, single-seat biplanes armed with synchronized Vickers machine guns mounted on the fuselage. Fast, maneuverable, deadly in the hands of an experienced pilot who understood their capabilities and limitations. Captain Edward Manock was one of the most experienced pilots alive at that moment in the conflict. Edward Manock, 30 years old, from Canterbury, Kent. He'd enlisted in the Royal Army Medical Corps in 1914, then transferred to the Royal Engineers in 1915, and finally applied for pilot training in 1916. By November 1917, he'd racked up 19 confirmed kills against German aircraft. He was known among his fellow pilots as methodical, cautious, a perfectionist who never took unnecessary risks in combat. He'd survived when bolder, more reckless pilots hadn't. He'd learned to respect his aircraft's limits with almost scientific precision. He understood exactly what an SE-5A could and couldn't do under different atmospheric and combat conditions, which makes what happened on November 23rd completely impossible to explain with conventional reasoning.
But what was about to happen during that routine flight would change everything we think we know about Great War aviation. At 14:23 hours, Manock took off on what was designated as a routine reconnaissance patrol. Weather conditions were marginal. Cloud ceiling at 8,000 feet altitude, visibility 3 to 4 miles, wind from the northwest at 15 knots. His assigned patrol sector covered the area between Cambrai and Bourlon Wood. According to the squadron's operations log, he was to remain airborne no more than 90 minutes. He was flying solo, standard procedure for reconnaissance in progressively deteriorating weather. At 15:11 hours, ground personnel at the airfield received a radio transmission from Manock. The message was transcribed by Corporal James Whitfield of the Royal Engineers Signal Service. The full text read, "Object observed at extreme altitude, approximately 20,000 feet, Sector 7 northeast of Cambrai, luminous, no engine sound, climbing to investigate. 20,000 feet altitude. The XE-5A had a service ceiling of 17,000 feet under ideal temperature and atmospheric pressure conditions. In combat, most pilots operated between 10,000 and 15,000 feet maximum. At 20,000 feet, the air was too thin for reliable rotary engine performance. Pilots experienced severe hypoxia, spatial disorientation, progressive loss of consciousness. No pilot in 1917 would attempt to reach 20,000 feet deliberately. Certainly not Manick, who understood aircraft limitations better than most of his contemporaries. At 15:18 hours, a second transmission was received. Corporal Whitfield recorded, "Object holding at 20,000 feet, no engine sound, pursuing." Those were the last officially recorded words received from Captain Edward Manick. According to testimony from Lieutenant Harold Balfour, who was monitoring radio traffic that afternoon from the communications station, a third transmission came through at 15:23 hours, heavily distorted, barely audible. Balfour described it in his statement to intelligence officers this way: "I heard what seemed to be Manick's voice, but the words were unintelligible. There was interference, a high-pitched tone that made comprehension impossible, then absolute silence." The radio log shows no entry for this mysterious third transmission. Lieutenant Balfour filed a written report detailing what he'd heard. The report was confiscated by Major Richard Blomfield within 2 hours. Balfour received orders not to discuss the transmission with absolutely anyone under threat of charges for violation of military security. What you're about to discover about Manick's fate defies all known medical and aeronautical logic.
When Manick didn't return by 1600 hours, the squadron initiated standard search and rescue procedures. Visibility had worsened considerably. 3 aircraft were dispatched to search the assigned patrol sector. They found absolutely nothing. By nightfall, Captain Manick was officially recorded as missing in action. The operational assumption was he'd been shot down over German-controlled territory. His aircraft would be found 3 days later, but not where anyone expected. On November 26, 1917, a French cavalry patrol operating near Valenciennes, 40 miles northeast of Cambrai, in territory deeply controlled by German forces, discovered an SE-5A sitting intact in an open field. The aircraft showed no visible damage whatsoever. No bullet holes from machine gun fire, no shrapnel marks from anti-aircraft shells. The engine cowling was completely intact. The wings had no tears or breaks. The propeller wasn't broken. The landing gear was perfectly functional. The aircraft hadn't crashed into the ground at high speed. It had landed, or been carefully deposited in that field by some unknown force. Captain Edward Manick was in the pilot's cockpit, dead. According to the French cavalry officer who discovered the aircraft, Lieutenant Philippe Moreau, Manick appeared to be sleeping peacefully. His hands were positioned on the control stick. His body showed no visible trauma of any kind, no penetrating wounds, no blood, no burns. His flight suit was completely intact without tears. His goggles were in their proper position. There was no sign of violent struggle, no indication of aerial combat, no evidence of catastrophic mechanical failure. The French immediately notified British command. The body was transferred to a British field hospital in Arras on November 27th. Captain William Morrison of the Royal Army Medical Corps conducted the initial examination of the corpse. His preliminary findings, recorded in Medical Log 47B231, noted, "Subject presents no visible external injuries, no fractures detected on complete physical examination, no signs of severe hypoxia or frostbite despite altitude reported in transmissions. Cause of death? undetermined, pending full autopsy. But what the autopsy would reveal, or rather what it wouldn't reveal, is just the beginning of a suppression pattern that continues to this day. Hit subscribe if you want to understand how an experienced pilot can die without any determinable medical cause, because what's coming next reveals the most disturbing systematic pattern of witness elimination from World War I.
The autopsy was performed on November 28th by Major Thomas Henley, Senior Medical Officer of the Royal Army Medical Corps. The autopsy report physically exists. It's archived at the National Archives in Kew under reference WO 339/45782. It's sealed until the year 2044. What we know about its contents comes from exactly two independent documentary sources. First, a memorandum from Major General Hugh Trenchard, commander of the Royal Flying Corps, dated December 2, 1917. The memo makes specific reference to medical findings inconsistent with known causes of pilot fatality. That phrase appears verbatim in the document that was partially declassified in 1998. Second, testimony from Sergeant Albert Dawson, who served as medical assistant during the complete autopsy. Dawson was interviewed in 1963 by historian Donald Fletcher as part of an oral history project about the RFC. The interview was never officially published. The recording is held at the Imperial War Museum, but remains under permanent restricted access. A transcript obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 2009, heavily redacted with complete sections removed, includes this verbatim passage. Major Henley conducted the examination for 3 full hours without interruption. He found no determinable physical cause of death. There was no heart failure, no stroke, no internal hemorrhaging of any kind. He kept repeating it made no medical sense. The captain's body showed no signs of the altitude he'd supposedly reached, according to transmissions. His lungs were completely clear, no fluid accumulation, no cellular damage consistent with oxygen deprivation. It was as if he'd simply stopped living, without any reason the human body would recognize. Major Henley submitted his complete report on November 29th. He was ordered to London for interrogation on December 1st. He returned to France on December 8th and never spoke about the Manic case with anyone again. Major Henley died in March 1951. His personal papers, donated to the Wellcome Library in 1952, contain absolutely no reference to the case. His military service file shows a complete void in entries between November 28th and December 8th, 1917. 10 days of activity simply erased from the official record. And just when it seemed the case would be buried forever, the systematic elimination pattern began. The official explanation for Manic's death, released to the press on December 3, 1917, stated he'd been killed in aerial combat against German fighters. The Times published his obituary on December 4th under the headline, "RFC Ace Falls in Battle." No mention was made of the 3-day delay between his disappearance and the discovery of his aircraft. The location wasn't mentioned, 40 miles beyond any active combat zone. The intact condition of the aircraft and his uninjured body weren't mentioned. But Manic wasn't the only witness to what happened that day over Cambrai. The object he chased was observed by other pilots that afternoon, and every one of them would die or disappear under circumstances that defy all reasonable statistical probability. Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, 24 years old, from Manchester. He was piloting an SE-5A on patrol approximately 5 miles south of Manic's position. At 15:14 hours, according to his flight report filed on November 23rd, he observed a luminous object at extreme altitude, stationary despite high-altitude winds, reflecting sunlight in a manner inconsistent with known aircraft of any belligerent nation. Bradley's report reached his squadron commander, Captain Jeffrey Norton, at 17:30 hours. Norton forwarded it to wing headquarters with a handwritten notation. Pilot is experienced and reliable. Recommend immediate investigation of this sighting. Intelligence officers arrived at Bradley's squadron the following morning. They interrogated him for 2 hours without interruption. His flight report, Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, 24 years old, from Manchester. He was piloting an SE-5A on patrol approximately 5 miles south of Mannix position. At 15:14 hours, according to his flight report filed on November 23rd, he observed a luminous object at extreme altitude, stationary despite high-altitude winds, reflecting sunlight in a manner inconsistent with known aircraft of any belligerent nation. Bradley's report reached his squadron commander, Captain Jeffrey Norton, at 17:30 hours. Norton forwarded it to wing headquarters with a handwritten notation. Pilot is experienced and reliable. Recommend immediate investigation of this sighting. Intelligence officers arrived at Bradley's squadron the following morning. They interrogated him for 2 hours without interruption. His flight report was confiscated and never returned. He was specifically instructed not to file any additional reports about the incident under threat of court-martial. According to testimony from his wingman, Lieutenant Peter Ashford, Bradley became noticeably withdrawn after the intensive interrogation. In a letter to his sister, dated November 28th, Bradley wrote verbatim, "Something happened on Friday that I cannot explain in writing under any circumstances." Intelligence officers made it very clear that discussing it would be considered a severe breach of military security. "If anything should happen to me, you must know I witnessed something our side doesn't want acknowledged under any circumstances." Soon you'll understand why this letter never reached its final destination. On December 6, 1917, during a routine patrol over Arras, Bradley's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire. He was killed instantly. Official cause: direct hit from a German flak battery. The circumstances weren't remarkable, except for one detail noted in the incident report by his squadron commander. Bradley's aircraft was at 4,000 feet when hit, unusually low for an experienced pilot in an area with known, well-documented anti-aircraft positions. Fellow pilots reported that Bradley had been flying lower than normal for several consecutive days, as if deliberately exposing himself to ground fire. His sister, Margaret Bradley, received his personal effects in January 1918. The letter he'd mentioned in his November 28th correspondence wasn't among them. She wrote to the War Office requesting information about the missing letter. The response, dated February 12, 1918, stated that all personal documents sent to families were subject to military censorship and that certain items couldn't be released for national security reasons. No additional explanation was provided about what the letter contained or why it represented a security risk. But this was just the beginning of the real problem. What was about to happen with the remaining witnesses would prove this was a deliberate, systematic pattern. Smash that subscribe button if this witness elimination pattern is disturbing you, because the most shocking revelation about what happened to everyone else who witnessed the object hasn't come yet.
Corporal James Whitfield, 22 years old, from Birmingham, the radio operator who transcribed Mannix transmissions in real time. He documented absolutely everything he heard on November 23rd in the station's communications log. At 2100 hours that same day, his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Preston, ordered Whitfield to surrender the complete log. Preston personally removed 3 pages covering the period from 1510 hours to 1530 hours. According to Sergeant Harold Mills, who shared quarters with Whitfield, the corporal was visibly shaken by the direct order.
Mills testified subsequently in a statement provided to investigators in 1971 that Whitfield told him verbatim, "I wrote down exactly what I heard, word for word without any alteration, but they're acting like it never happened, like Manic never transmitted those disturbing messages. Why would they remove official communications records unless they're hiding something extremely serious?" Whitfield was transferred to a signals unit in Mesopotamia on December 15, 1917. Official stated reason: urgent operational requirements. He died on April 3, 1918, in a field hospital in Basra. Official cause: complications from severe dysentery. Medical records from the Basra hospital, partially destroyed in a 1941 fire and subsequently reconstructed from surviving fragments, note that Whitfield had been in strict isolation for 6 full days before his sudden death. The treating physician's report states, patient exhibited symptoms completely inconsistent with standard bacterial dysentery presentation. Fever absent, minimal dehydration. Death occurred suddenly without expected progression of known disease. The physician, Captain Edward Thornton of the RAMC, requested formal permission to conduct a full autopsy to determine the actual cause of death. Permission was denied by Theater Medical Command without explanation. Captain Thornton filed a formal written objection. The objection was rejected without appeal. Captain Thornton was reassigned to a casualty clearing station in Palestine 2 weeks after the incident. He survived the war and practiced medicine in Edinburgh until his death in 1958. In a private memoir written in 1953 but never published, archived at the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, Thornton wrote, "I was ordered to sign a death certificate attributing the corporal's death to dysentery despite clear evidence the diagnosis was completely incorrect. When I protested based on established medical standards, I was removed from the case and immediately transferred. I learned quickly that certain military deaths weren't to be questioned under any circumstances, regardless of medical ethics or professional standards of care."
Lieutenant Harold Balfour, 23 years old, from London, the radio officer who reported hearing Manic's third distorted transmission. His written statement describing the transmission, filed on November 24th, was confiscated by Major Blomfield. Balfour was ordered to report to Wing Intelligence Headquarters at St. Omer on November 27th. He was interrogated for 7 consecutive hours without rest. According to subsequent testimony from Captain Michael Hartley, who shared the train to St. Omer with Balfour, the lieutenant seemed extremely anxious and kept obsessively repeating, "I only reported what I heard with absolute accuracy. That's my duty as a communications officer. Why are they treating this like I've committed some grave crime?" Balfour returned to his squadron on November 28th and flatly refused to discuss the interrogation with absolutely anyone. On January 14, 1918, while on leave in London, Balfour fell in front of an underground train at King's Cross Station. He died instantly on impact. The inquest, conducted on January 16th at St. Pancras Coroner's Court, heard testimony from 3 separate eyewitnesses. All 3 stated Balfour had been standing well back from the platform edge. None saw him move forward voluntarily. One witness, Mr. Edward Collins, a railway employee, testified, "The lieutenant was reading a newspaper quietly, standing perhaps 3 feet from the platform edge. The train was approaching, clearly visible. I looked toward the other end of the platform briefly, maybe 2 seconds at most. When I looked back toward where the lieutenant had been standing, he was falling onto the tracks. I saw no one near him at all. He made no sound of alarm. It was as if he'd simply dropped without any comprehensible reason." The inquest ruled accidental death. The case was closed within 48 hours without additional investigation. Balfour's family challenged the verdict, citing his excellent service record and completely stable mental state. The War Office responded that combat stress could manifest in unpredictable ways, and the verdict would stand unchanged. No additional investigation was conducted under any circumstances. Balfour's mother, Elizabeth Balfour, wrote a letter to the Times in February 1918 questioning the extreme speed of the inquest and the lack of appropriate thorough investigation. The letter was published on February 19th. She died of a stroke on March 3, 1918, at age 52. Her personal physician noted the stroke was unusually severe for a woman with no previous documented history of cardiovascular problems. And just when it seemed the pattern couldn't get any darker, the investigators who tried to document all this decades later,
Lieutenant Peter Ashford, 25 years old, from Sussex. Bradley's wingman, who'd witnessed his friend's growing anxiety after the November 23rd incident. Ashford began asking persistent questions about what Bradley had really seen. He spoke with other pilots who'd flown that day, seeking additional information. He tried to locate Bradley's confiscated flight report without success. On December 20th, 1917, Ashford was summoned to a meeting with intelligence officers at Wing headquarters. The meeting lasted 3 full hours. When he returned, according to his mechanic, Sergeant Frank Morrison, Ashford was pale as death and absolutely refused to speak about what had been discussed in that meeting. Ashford flew his last mission on January 8, 1918. During a patrol over the Ypres sector, his aircraft was seen entering a cloud bank at 6,000 feet altitude. It never emerged from the other side. No aircraft wreckage was found. No German unit claimed the kill. Weather conditions were clear, unlimited visibility, no active thunderstorms. The cloud bank he entered was subsequently described by other pilots as unusually dense for the altitude and prevailing atmospheric conditions. Ashford was recorded as missing in action. His body was never recovered, despite extensive searches. His aircraft was never located at all. Sergeant Albert Dawson, the medical assistant who witnessed Manock's complete autopsy, after Major Henley departed for London in December 1917, Dawson was reassigned to a casualty clearing station near Amiens. He served there until March 1918. On March 21st, the first day of the German spring offensive, his station was completely overrun by enemy forces. Dawson was captured and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. He survived and returned to England in December 1918. In 1962, he was contacted by historian Donald Fletcher for an oral history project about medical services during the war. Dawson agreed to be interviewed about his military medical service. During the interview, conducted on April 17, 1963, he described Manock's autopsy with extraordinarily specific detail. Fletcher's notes indicate Dawson was clear, specific, and deeply disturbed by what he'd witnessed 45 years earlier. The recording was deposited at the Imperial War Museum on May 2, 1963. It was classified as restricted access on May 8th without any explanation provided. Dawson died on November 19, 1963, exactly 6 months after the interview. Official cause, heart attack at age 68. He had no previous documented history of heart disease. His personal physician, Dr. Richard Hartwell, noted on the death certificate that the heart attack was completely unexpected given the patient's excellent general health. Dawson had scheduled a follow-up interview with Fletcher for November 25th. He died exactly 6 days before it could occur.
Donald Fletcher, the historian conducting the oral history project about the RFC. After Dawson's death, Fletcher attempted to access the restricted interview recording. The Imperial War Museum formally denied his request, citing inexplicable national security concerns. Fletcher filed a formal complaint in January 1964. In March 1964, while researching in the museum's archives, he discovered documentary references to similar incidents, other RFC pilots who'd reported unusual sightings and subsequently died under questionable circumstances during and after the war. He began compiling a comprehensive study connecting all these cases into an undeniable pattern. On July 11, 1964, Fletcher's office at Cambridge University was broken into overnight. Only his research files on the RFC project were stolen. Nothing else was disturbed at all. No other office in the entire building was targeted that night. Fletcher reported the theft to local police immediately. The case was never officially solved. He tried to reconstruct his research from memory and remaining notes he kept at his personal residence. On October 3, 1964, he was struck by a car while crossing a street in London. The driver didn't stop under any circumstances. Fletcher suffered severe injuries and spent 4 full months hospitalized. He never resumed his investigation into the RFC incidents. The project was quietly discontinued in 1965 without any publication or final academic record.
You're watching this now because you sense on some level that something fundamental is missing from the official Great War histories. The battles are meticulously documented, casualties are precisely recorded, military strategies have been exhaustively analyzed by generations of historians. But there's another layer to that war that's been systematically erased from all publicly accessible records. Edward Mannix saw something on November 23, 1917, over the skies of Cambrai. Something operating at altitudes no aircraft of that era could reach with available technology. Something that produced no audible sound despite being observed by multiple trained pilots from different positions. Something that led to his death in a way that medical science in 1917, or even in our present day, can't explain under any established theoretical framework. His final transmission was deleted from all official communications records. His autopsy report remained sealed for 127 years after his inexplicable death. Every witness who could corroborate what really happened died within the following 14 months, without exception. Some died in combat, officially speaking. Others perished in accidents that investigators found deeply suspicious but were ordered not to investigate further. Others died from medical conditions that physicians documented as completely inconsistent with standard progression of known diseases. The pattern is absolutely undeniable for anyone willing to see it without prejudice or denial. November 23, 2027 marks the 110th anniversary of Mannix's disappearance and death. Independent researchers have noted the date has attracted considerable attention from private organizations tracking similar phenomena throughout world military history. There are documented indications that the sealed autopsy file may be reviewed for possible partial declassification that specific year. Whether November 23, 2027 will bring genuine revelation or simply another suppressed anniversary remains to be seen. But for those who understand the historical pattern, for those who recognize systematic suppression when they see it clearly documented, the date carries significant weight that can't be ignored.
On November 23, 1917, over the skies of Cambrai sector in France, Captain Edward Mannix chased something that shouldn't exist according to his time's technology and scientific understanding. He reached an altitude that should have been absolutely impossible for any aircraft of the era. He transmitted descriptions that were immediately deleted from all accessible official records. He died in a way that defied all established medical explanation and continues to do so over a century later.
and every person who could definitively confirm what happened was systematically silenced within the following 14 months, without any exception. They classified all relevant documents. They suppressed every uncomfortable testimony. They physically eliminated witnesses through a combination of convenient combat deaths, strange accidents, and medically inexplicable illnesses. But they couldn't eliminate the fundamental truth of what occurred. The files remain sealed until the year 2044. The suppression pattern continues operating actively to this day. Remember specifically the date November 23rd, 2027. Watch significant dates carefully. The witnesses from the Cambrai sector in 1917 tried to tell us the truth. They were violently silenced by forces we don't fully understand. But their message persists in the documentary fragments that survived the suppression. We're not alone in the universe. We've never been alone throughout our history. And over the battlefields of the Great War, that truth became absolutely undeniable for those who witnessed it directly with their own eyes. They tried to bury it under a complete century of military classification, statistically impossible coincidences, and extremely convenient deaths. But the truth persists, waiting to be revealed. Remember the impossible altitude Manic reached. Remember the absolute silence of the object he chased. Remember the name, Captain Edward Manic, and all the systematically eliminated witnesses. The pattern continues to our present day.
Drop a subscribe if this video changed your perspective on what really happened in the skies during World War I, because every week I investigate the classified testimonies that military forces worldwide don't want you to know about.